welcome to the Fruit Market, in person and online. I'm Fiona Bradley, I'm the director here, and I'm overjoyed and slightly overwhelmed to be in conversation with Daniel Silva and Phyllida Barlow. I'd like to say this conversation has been a long time in the planning, but it really hasn't. It was one of those wonderful serendipitous, Daniel and I were talking about something, and Daniel mentioned having bumped into Phyllida and having had a conversation, and I thought, wouldn't that be nice if I could eavesdrop on that conversation? Wouldn't it be nice if we could all eavesdrop on that conversation? And so asked Phyllida if she would ever consider coming up to be in conversation here in Daniel's show, and thank you, Phyllida. It's one of those things that fell into place, so welcome. Phyllida obviously made a show with us, an extraordinary show with us, and we're sitting right where one of the large sculptures, there were lots of large sculptures down here. I know that some people in the audience saw the show, so you know how incredibly crammed and full of large sculptures it was, and there is something quite strange about sitting here. I think we probably stood about there to talk about your show, Phyllida. There's something very odd about the kinds of histories that galleries have and the way that sculpture in particular continues to inhabit spaces a long time after it's gone, and we'll maybe talk about that. But that was 2015 that Phyllida's show was here, and continues to help us understand the space, I think. And of course the Fruit Market hadn't been redeveloped when Phyllida made the show. It was, in fact, your show was quite a lot about helping us knock the Fruit Market down and reimagine the Fruit Market. So that was kind of interesting. The building has changed and the space has changed. But anyway, the idea for this conversation is that we will speak for about 45 minutes. Daniel and Phyllida will speak together. I'll speak a little bit, ask them questions, see how we get on. And then there will be time for questions from you, from the audience in the room, and also the audience online. Ruth is staffing the Zoom, so she'll be asking questions from people online. And then afterwards, Phyllida and Daniel will both be around if you would like to buy a book, special price for this evening. If you would like to buy either book, either Daniel's book, which is launching today. I keep touching it like this because it's the first time we've been able to spend time with it. All the photography in the book was taken in the gallery in this show, so the book is launching today, and Phyllida's book, which also has the exhibition photography from this her show here. So both of those books will be for sale. If you'd like to buy a book, Phyllida and Daniel will sign them, or perhaps if you have a private question, you could ask then there. Anyway, enough of the admin. I wanted to start, there's so many ways to start this conversation, but what I think I want to do is start by talking about Lover Pink, which is the piece right at the end, it's right in our sight line that we can see. It's the piece in the small gallery at the end. He's looking out towards us, and I want to start by asking you both about that because of a thing you say, Daniel, in the conversation we had together, that in some ways that work is at the origin of the show, and the reason it's at the origin of the show is because it doesn't know what it is. It's a sculpture that doesn't know what it is, and the idea of this intrigues me. I make exhibitions because I don't know what art is, and I work with artists because I want to find out more. And it seems to me that to make a whole show like this, spinning around an object that doesn't quite know what it is a very fertile and intriguing place to start. So can I ask you both to consider Lover Pink as an object that doesn't know what it is and what that means for an exhibition?
Maybe I can say that when I started making it, it was parts. So it was like found objects which I made in the studio and then put them together. And when I put them together, I glue them together with epoxy glue. So it's very much about sculpture. It became what it is, but it wasn't what I intended to do. And I was quite surprised by it. And then it got this pink, which is very much a Philip Gaston pink, which then led me into opened a lot of new doors for me. So in a way, that work started paving the way for the rest of the show. So instead of me telling it what to do, it told me what to do.
And it's obviously quite nice for us because Phyllida, I think you'll remember quite a lot of what you did started in that little room. And there was a sculpture that wasn't really intended to be in there, and you put an awful lot in there, and the rest of it span around from there. There is what is it to make What is it to improvise like that? What is it to make something that tells you what it is? Do you work in that way? Do you recognise that?
Totally. I think maybe human imagination is such that the outlets it finds for itself, the imagination finds for itself, is unfathomable. It's kind of uncharted territory, and let's hope it always will be that. Because if you're saying there's a mystery attached to this work, I don't find it mysterious, but I find it totally alluring. It's like a seductive object. But here we are in a place which provides the encounter and allows you to get close to these things. And it is an extraordinary experience because you're up close to something which shows the sort of residue of a human act. And it's up to you to then make that encounter work on your behalf. You have to. It isn't a passive experience, it's active, and that's what, for me, sculpture is. It asks the viewer to be very active in the encounter. You have to walk round it. At the moment, it's stark as an image. You know, it has what you call a silhouette. But I think the way that silhouette can be dissolved by getting close up to it is part of the grand phenomenon of sculpture.
So
I want to give an anecdote. Phyllida was my professor at the Slade, 1995, and we would have these kind of discussions. And then I applied to do an MA at the Royal College, and I put out images of the works I made with Phyllida's guidance over 4 years.
Not my guidance, no.
And she said to me, "So what do you want to say?" And I said to her, "Phyllida, my hands are cleverer than my brain." And I think that this is what Lava Pink is the way it's made, and this is how the whole show evolves, where things are made and then you have to evolve around them, both physically, like Phyllida said, walking around them, but as well trying to understand them. But they are made, and from them being made, things happen. So sculptures can really change things around them and make things happen, and that's how this show kind of evolves. And I think sculpture does ask, or this kind of sculpture asks from us, the viewer, a lot. We have to try and imagine, understand, and explain to ourselves what it is.
I think we have to let go of understanding.
That's true.
And try and find another part of our emotional, sentient, visceral selves that just says this is what it is. But what are the questions I can ask where I'm not expecting the right answer? You know, maybe I have to ask myself certain questions.
Yeah.
You know, do aspects of the work kind of repel one even, and is that such a bad thing, or is one searching for a sort of conventional kind of beauty that one's got to overcome in a way?
And is that what you mean by it not having a subject? Is it that it doesn't have a subject, or that it has several subjects, or it's sliding away from having a subject, or it's putting the responsibility for finding a subject onto you? Is it making us the subject?
Exactly. I think all those things, but maybe it's a kind of questioning of what verbal language does to art, and what maybe in the 21st century we've seen such radical change through issue-based and identity politics, all of which I think has turned modernism in that lineage sense from the 20th century on its head, is all for the good. But I think sometimes to be constantly told what the message is about, almost as though the viewer are automatically in some kind of wrong place because you're not getting it, I think is very, very controlling. And I think that's what I mean by subject, in a way, a subject that in a way, wants to be in a parallel world to the actual visual experience you're having.
Can I just check that everyone can hear Phyllida? I'm aware that the sound is dropping in and
Something
out.
funny about my...
Is it okay? Do we need to pause and swap, or are we okay? New mic is coming. Yes.
Can you hear now? Yes. Okay. Good.
Okay, so we were on subjectivity, and is it as simple then that the exhibition doesn't impose a subject on the notion of a subject, or is it that each work doesn't? Is it that as we approach a work of sculpture, the sculpture kind of blasts into our understanding this kind of non-verbal language, that we have to meet it on its own terms?
Yeah. It is for me. I mean, it's not that I'm saying a subject is a bad thing. I think that it is how, it's like having an idea. What does that mean? And I think one of the things that happens with making is that you destroy the idea, or the idea gets replaced with the act of making. Yeah. And I think that it's something about idea and subject that maybe I'm talking about, more than condemning subject to eternal hell or whatever it is. But I think it is how verbal language can intervene and make things justifiable, rather than perhaps there is a whole aspect of this work that's quite feral. You know, you don't know where it's come from. The making of it is so evidenced with the streaking of the finger marks or the pressing of the clay, that in a way is its language, rather than needing to have that verbal justification of what is the work, you know, what is that pink sculpture at the end, you know, that has a kind of figurative residue, but it doesn't necessarily sit comfortably with that idea of being able to comfortably say, oh, this is an interpretation of a figure.
And does that resonate with you, Daniel? Do you think that's...
I'm very interested in this idea that ideas don't stick, and because we can sit here together and have loads of ideas, but ideas don't make. You can maybe set out and with an idea, but then it evolves into something else, and I prefer to kind of make without having too many ideas. Maybe have some kind of a framework, so there is some kind of but maybe the structure could be more of structure of making, of coming to the studio and evolving around that. And then I think sculpture has a different language. It's not a verbal language. It's very much a language that we meet it with our body. You know, Phyllida used to talk about, and again, this is something I quote a lot, not only when Phyllida sits next to me, but when she had young kids and had no time, and she'd make sculpture in the night, in the dark. So you don't really have to look at sculpture when you make it. And a lot of the sculptures in this show, when I made them, I wasn't really looking. So the hand, you know, has its intelligence of making, and that kind of makes the form. Obviously, you look at it and decide if you like it, but there's a speed to it, which is there not because I'm in a hurry, but because I don't want to dwell on moments. Yes, and I think then they become things which you relate to in a non-verbal way. Maybe in the same way that when you dream, you don't really talk. You know, things happen, and it's quite similar in that sense, that it's not a verbal.
Do you think that, like the work upstairs where you worked with a dancer, wasn't it? Do you think there's something about the way you were working then that wasn't copying the dancer? You were almost turning your back on them to work non-visually. Do you think there's something about sculpture being the kind of remains of something? It's like what's left over from having to think and work out. That's all done with and it gets in the way.
Yeah.
And what you're then left with is almost like an afterthought that tries to generate a presence, but possibly don't know what that presence is. I find that, for me, there's something very exciting about the unfinished work, the incomplete. And I know Rodin used the expression non finito about his work, you know.
Is that because that notion of generation is still there, the generative? It's not a residue. You're not trying to make it look like something.
Exactly. It has this potential, and I think it's quite, in a way, possibly presents quite a kind of worrying condition in terms of thinking about art as being a very complete, finished work that, you know, it's behaving in the right kind of way. And to renege on that by enjoying something that isn't quite complete in some way, isn't finished, and is possibly is a kind of leftover of a whole journey or experience that
process
is
of making. Especially, but especially now, I think, when we spend so much time on the screen, and where you can make objects out of, you know, from an image on a screen and then get them, you know, scanned and printed, and that brings a whole world of objects which are without any presence because they made out of nothing in a way, you know. So you can walk next to these 3D scanned objects, but they don't have anything in them, you know. They kind of don't carry anything, and that's, I think that the hand today is so important, and, you know, leaving the mark, which is something that we can look at Greek and Roman sculptures that were made 3,000 years ago and still see a fingerprint and get a feel of that presence, of that humanity, and connect to it and try and understand it, obviously, through our understanding of today. And maybe by having this unfinished object or something which is in movement and in continuation from making to being, it's very important, I think, especially now.
I think it's complex now, isn't it, that sculpture for me is essentially still, silent, dumb, deals with weight and size and things that the screen can be very duplicitous about. I don't understand how working on a screen where there's no evidence of mistake, you know, there's a constant erasure of the very things that often are the triggers to discovering something or finding something out, you know. I mean, yes, you and I could go on a rampage that would bore everybody senseless about one's mistrust of the digital world.
No, but we live in it and we function in it, but, you know, you can't understand a sculpture without knocking into it or pushing it over. You know, there's this
please don't do that. Actually, no.
A brilliant photograph of Louise, or video with Louise Bourgeois throwing things on the floor. And then when she throws it on the floor, she really understands what it is, you know, and how it reacts and how, you know, what it's made of. And I think that's really important if you, in this business of making objects.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's necessary, you know, you both use screens when they're necessary and they're useful. I wouldn't say for me that you're in flight from screens. It's more that you're both artists that enjoy the stuff of life and the stuff of sculpture. And maybe it's something that if you're not playing around with the stuff as it was, you don't know when to walk away. You don't know when to let go, or it can't take you by surprise. It can't do that sense of, you know, it's the end of the day, you're tired, you think, oh, I'll leave that, you turn around, you think, oh, maybe you're done. Maybe actually you're done there. So maybe it's more you're moving towards the material, actually, than away from the digital.
Not only is one kind of having this relationship with the sort of growing of something with materials, but it's also the empty space that surrounds that work as well, so that the relationship is it's as though one's own body is constantly interrupting something, that one is getting in the way, you know, of this thing, whereas a screen, which is a rectangular thing, has already made so many decisions about space and even time, you know.
So who's making the decisions in the studio then?
I think it's living with the stuff. So you make, but then they're there, and you walk. I always think that looking at something like in the corner of your eye is better than trying to have an action of looking at it. So they made by living with them, which is very human, you know, it's very natural. So you make something and you kind of live in the studio and it's there and you're kind of not sure about it, but it kind of evolves, or your kind of relationship towards this new thing in the world evolves. Because usually when things come, I don't trust them yet, you know, they need time to see if they're worthwhile staying, if they've...
Yes. Is that something to do with doubt, or is it...
It's
maybe is it about the relationship?
Yeah, the relationship has to grow and evolve, and I think because when something first arrives, it's quite, you know, it's a celebration as well. But then you're not really sure if it's love or not, and you have to take your time and yeah.
Is doubt one of your materials, Phyllida? I always remember when I think we were talking about Louise Bourgeois, and you said to me, of course, the most important material for her is gravity. And it was my first understanding of the notion of an immaterial material, that one of the something a sculptor has to deal with is gravity, and maybe something a sculptor has to deal with is doubt as well.
Yes, you know, gravity is such a huge material in terms of making things and letting them fall and discovering things about that it also challenges one about what is possible. And I suppose in my work, I always want to take on something about our physical relationship with the relationship of a space. So it involves size and trying to go beyond my own size. It's about exploration. And I suppose that, because it involves certain kinds of ambitions physically, it also generates doubt, like, is this just stupid, you know, to be doing this, or how can I justify this kind of adventure that goes up into the upper regions of a space? What does it say about my sense of being a human being, you know, to want to renege on the kind of eye-level way of looking at art, you know, and allow myself to explore something about the physical gesture being out of reach, and what that does for an audience as well. So yes, there's a lot of doubt, but I think doubt shouldn't be a protective thing, you know, that, oh, I'm so worried about this. I think it's got to become a brave thing, and you know, one challenges one's own doubt and in a way takes it on.
I want to ask you together to explore abstraction and figuration. I know that sounds really dry, but it seems to me that both of you have a sense of how to make something which is about looking and isn't about what things look like. And we're back to subjects, I suppose, but you know, we're sitting surrounded by possibly the most figurative work in the show, and I still don't think they are. I think there's something about the mark making, these things that are in motion and in flux. And I always think about your work also, Phyllida, as in flux. And yet they're enormous things which clearly aren't in flux, otherwise we'd all be squashed. But what is it to make a mark which is mobile? What is it to make a sculpture which is somehow in transit conceptually? What is that? How do you do that? Or why? Or is it important? Or maybe I'm wrong and they don't do that.
I think it's something that's come up quite a lot in
know.
our discussions. And I think if we go back to the warehouse space, where the works could be quite abstract because they kind of these totem vessels going up. But when you see people standing next to them, they become very forms, but very forms which have a relationship to body. So they have this relationship to figuration. The body that the person who's standing next to them, my body as the maker of them. As if a lot of the marks were made, by, you can see where not only the hand, but parts of the arm made these totem holes. But then again, they've got this another level where they are like looking at us, even though they don't have faces or eyes. So for me, it's very much between the presence of the work, from being figurative to being maybe more abstract as well. But for Phyllida, I don't know how for you.
I think it's the idea of interruption, and also perhaps my subject is sculpture itself, and also trying to unpick what I find conventional about sculpture, and I like the notion of it being in transit. I like that sense that maybe one can make objects that have a restlessness about them. And maybe this is all fantasy, because in the end they are what they are. They sit on the floor and they're still silent and dumb, but maybe the relationship is that something is about to change, that something has a potential for change. That it could have another layer of paint on it, it could be shifted this way and that way, and holding on to that even when I have to walk away from them. I'm interested that you're very sure about when they're finished reading in the essays. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Whereas for me, it's a huge area of uncertainty about whether something's as finished. It's as if I'm not comfortable with that notion that this has to suddenly conform to a sculptural language that I've had problems with all my life,
You've talked about the difficulty of making an invented form and something which does slip out from underneath, the need to look like something else. Is it something to do with that? Do you like to keep going until it looks like something that doesn't look like anything? Is that what it is?
I think both ends of the spectrum. I'm quite interested in how we remember things and the sort of how we forget things, remembering and forgetting, and then trying to emulate that through whatever materials are to hand to do that in. So if for me it's some kind of hoarding shape or something, to me they're like vestiges of that. They may be associated with that, but they're not that. So it's that fascinating thing of when you look at a photograph, you say, oh, and it's a photograph of an apple. You say, oh, there's an apple. And in fact, it isn't. It's a piece of paper. And I think our verbal language and our brain language are constantly switching about those convictions about what is real. Is a video screen less real than this bench? Do we have a hierarchy? How do we look? Do we see the color of those heads over there before we see the heads? How does our brain and our bodies order the world around us? And to me, it's interesting to try and play with that, to make sometimes color the thing that you see and not the shape, or the shape comes second. And I think that's for me, that is all about a kind of relationship with sculpture over the years.
Let's do colour, because there is something fascinating about colour in this show, and I don't know how much they've taken you by surprise, Phyllida, these highly coloured, painted on objects.
I think I
I just want to say
No,
something
no, go
about
on, yes.
what you said beforehand about change, because with sculpture, you know, you can, even when you live with it, say, it's ever changing. So you see it one day, or I'll say, I came today to see the show and it looked very different than it was last time. Maybe I've changed, maybe the work's changed, but I think sculpture allows that very human experience of meeting something which changed. Like if you meet yourself in the mirror,
Yes,
you change, or
yeah.
if you meet I can meet you, you change. And in terms of color, so for this show, I think this is the first show I've introduced so much color to the sculpture. The sculptures are first made in clay and then fired, and they come out of the kiln, which is this black clay because it's got metal in it. And then I introduce oil paint, painter's oil paint, which is another story altogether. I think I was talking, to Barry Schwabsky. He said you could have just left them in the black, and I could have, but I decided to go another round with them. But again, they are painted in a very physical way. And sometimes I feel like the top layer they painted themselves, so it's I was just a partner to it.
Does the painted layer, because when I have used paint on my sculptures, it's like a slightly desperate attempt to find closure. You know, like the final act is the surface. Now, for God's sake, shut up and go away. But when I'm painting them, it's like, oh yeah, I must do another layer and another layer. But I wondered whether...
So some of them are don't need many layers, but some of them they just don't finish themselves. And it
like
goes
the ones,
on, the ones there, and then you can see like the orange paint coming through. So I don't know if it's me on a particular day, or some just want more attention and more time. But this layer of paint becomes a skin, you know, like, which kind of explains another way of looking at them, gives them another property.
Does it give a mood?
Yes, and behavior, you know. But the clay, sometimes the first layer is the clay just drinks the oil paint. It's like takes it in, and then afterwards you can kind of build it in. But using paint on sculpture is like a whole world in itself, because it's different than using it on canvas. You know, it's very much, again, when I paint them, I'm walking around them all the time, and you can see the footprints in the studio of me running around the sculptures to figure them out. But that takes more and more time for them to know that they finish and can leave the studio. I don't think, maybe there's only one sculpture in the whole show that I'm not sure that it's finished. It's the large blue.
The blue one.
The light blue one. That's the only one that I feel that maybe it could kind of have another go of working it out.
What, to change the colour of it, or to change the...
Just to continue working on it. That maybe it wants to evolve more.
Do you feel, I mean, obviously this is an unfair question because Phyllida, you've seen it for the first time today, but Daniel, not you. Do you think they've evolved without you? Do you think they've changed? Have they learned anything by being here in Scotland? I know that you take them by surprise. They change in a way when you see them from one thing to the next, but have they learned anything, do you think, by being here on their own? What is it to push a sculpture out into the world and let it fend for itself?
So I always tell the story that I make my works in families. They're usually 5 or 6 at a time.
Yeah.
And then 1 or 2 of them can leave. They leave the family like the same way. And they can evolve and then they can always come back. I think they changed me by being here. And I really, like I said earlier, I think sculpture can change the world. I really believe in that it can do things and make people act and understand and question. And so they've done. Have they changed? I think they have. In what way? They've gained confidence.
Yeah.
But today when I came, they looked more like objects from a chess kind of set. These guys here. I think maybe what changes as well, that you hear, you read a review, and that opens a whole kind of world of different ideas, which adds to your understanding of them, which changes them.
Do you like them being away? Is it? And I always think it must be unbearable, because we have as a curator, you have a completely different relationship to the motion of a sculpture. It comes towards you. You have conversations. You're lucky enough to go to the studio, but you begin to think about the sculpture, and then it comes towards you, and it lives in your space, and it's wonderful. Whereas you push it away, and you walk away from it. Is it hugely liberating or totally unbearable?
Liberating, yeah. I mean, for me, so much of the work isn't seen until it gets into the space because of this obsession and curiosity about height and things. So often it's the first time that I will actually encounter the work as I had imagined it. So it's a bit like going on stage and being told, you know, you've got the leading role, but you haven't learned your lines or anything. It's like having stage fright to take that on. And I think in that sense, there are so many things that you mentioned, the surprise and this, again, should that have been this, that, or the other, you know, all those feelings. Could it be this? Could it be that? And yes, I think it's both challenging and liberating, and I think the work does change, or it always changes me a bit. There's always another mile to run, you know, with that particular work or in that particular place. There's very rarely 100% satisfaction. You know, it's quite strange, that sense of not disappointment, but maybe a sense that, oh, maybe it should have been that or this or the other, you know. And I mean, in a way, we were touching on the subject of sustainability earlier, and I think for me it is quite a big thing, because there are so many costs now that are really huge. So the idea of big shows, I'm very much taking or trying to explore, even going back to ways I used to work, where I used to just take a whole heap of stuff to a place and then just assemble it, almost returning to that much more raw approach to the larger work, so that at the end, whatever happens to them isn't necessarily preserving the object. It's more they will either be destroyed or something else will happen to them, and then keep other sculptures which can live a longer life to a much more reasonable size. I mean, it sounds very dull in a way to be talking like that, but I think the time has come to take on certain bigger issues around making.
I think you're right. I think there's a huge sort of conversation there, but I suppose one of the things that points at, that throws up to me is, when you're thinking about the sculpture, do you, when it returns to you, when it pops back into you, I mean, one of the joyful things about sculpture for me is that it often comes back to you. You turn a corner and you remember one of your sculptures. Does the space matter? Is it the sculpture that comes back to you, or is it in a space? Because I know both of you've both incredibly good at space, and you have an incredible visual memory for a space. You know, Daniel managed to keep this space in your mind for a long time. This show's been a long time in coming. Because of COVID, it kept receding, and you managed to keep an idea and an understanding of this space even before it was even before we invented it next door. But does the space add to the meaning of the sculpture? If it's a big work and it's for a space, is that important? Or is there something about the feel of it that is its identity? Where does it live in the mind then?
Maybe you.
You don't have
To
to
me,
answer
there's
it.
always three things. There's the space, the work, and then the audience.
Yeah.
But in the studio, it's a totally much more private, stumbling kind of process of trying things out and them not working and trying again. But once all the ingredients arrive at the space, then it is the ambition is to make this exchange between space, audience and objects have some kind of symbiosis. It's a choreographic experience, you know, but that's not necessarily so with the smaller objects, you know, that's a very different, more, you know, conventional process, I see, from my point of view. But the things that remain, I think, are in my head, are the actual works, you know, and whether they could go elsewhere. So it's not just a site-specific experience. There is an afterlife to these things.
You both use a language of performance. It's fascinating. You talk about choreographing, you talk about being on stage, you talk about dancing, moving. For makers of what some might think immobile objects, you both have an incredibly ephemeral lightness of language around it. Fascinates me. And of course, you know, we're all here. The sculptures live because they're all in our minds. Mm-hmm. You know, even if you do make a big work and you tear it down and it never sees the light of day again, in some ways, you know, it has a lot of lives. They live on, don't they, in that way?
Yes.
Yeah. Not that that necessarily is enough, I think, when you make such amazing material things. We should perhaps throw it open. I am aware that I've been lucky enough to direct this a bit. Are there questions in the room or on the line? Or will we just carry on, which we're totally happy to do? I'm going to look and see if Ruth has been gathering any questions online to start us off, while see if there's any in the room. There is a mic. I'm speaking very slowly so we can get the mic to Ruth. If there is a question in the room, please, while these questions are being asked and answered, do stick your hand up so we know it's here. Ruth, do you want to ask us a question?
We've got one question about the works that are upstairs. Just someone who wants to hear a bit more about the tables and their legs.
Ah, yes. I would quite like to hear what Phyllida wants to say about the tables and their legs also. Let's do the tables and their legs upstairs. We were talking about the tables.
So the objects, I don't know if we mentioned the objects that are on the table I made with a dancer in my studio, where he'd come for a 3-day, he's an international contemporary dancer from a dance company called Lev, Sharon Ayal and Guy Bacher. And he came, the dancer Darren, to work with me, and I wasn't looking at him when I was making. It was more his presence. He did a compilation of music and I was making. And then most of the objects that are on the tables come from that exchange between us. The tables, I wanted some movement upstairs for the space because of the staircase, and I was looking at and making drawings for different kinds of tables, and the budget became crazy. So then I said, I had a really good moment where I said, I'll just make the legs, and then these goofy kind of half animal, half human, camel-like legs came, and it really works for the space and for my ideas around it. So you've got these tables, which have got the surfaces from the tables, which are zinc in the cafeteria, with these different stories or situations carried around the space. And then we spoke earlier on, I'll start you off, but you spoke about Brancusi, about the stacking.
Yeah, yeah.
And about I'm very interested in Fontana's ceramic works. But those, they kind of become these kind of evolving, moving sculptures, although they're very static, which are kind of, maybe they're going to fall, but they're very much stacked because nothing's really stuck, or it's very easy to take it all apart and move on.
Is it the accident of, almost the accident of when a sculpture sits on top of one of the legs that makes you think of Brancusi? Is it?
Just the way he would stack disparate elements. I like that very much, the sort of idea that the solution is staring you in the face, you know, and it's not going to have a logic. It brings me to the thing about knowing when something is right, even though it's slightly wrong. I think there's something slightly wrong about the works upstairs, the way they perform, but I think that's the appeal of it, you know, that it's not a seamless production, and these quite harsh zinc tables seem almost incompatible with, but that's what sculpture is. It's full of these kind of flaws which somehow work, somehow are right but wrong, and it's a complicated language in that respect. I mean, I can think of it in Brancusi's work, I can think of it in Rodin's work, and you know, numerous artists sculptors who've actually explored that kind of wrongness, that we're not making a bench, we're not making a chair, we're making something else, but it may use those kind of solutions that are in everyday life, like finding the tables in the canteen, you know, as being an appropriate decision to make. And I think that's what's so, you know, it's brave, and it's in a way risky as well, you know.
And there is something, I think, so extraordinary about the scale of them, but the legs are so big
Yes,
and the figures
yeah,
are so small, and yet you can read them. You get used to reading them like that, and they take me by surprise every time. You think, oh yes, these legs are enormous.
I mean, they're awkward, and
Yes,
I think
they are.
that's to their great advantage. It would be so easy to put each work on a nice sort of white plinth, but this does something very different to them. It creates an uncertainty, and I think, I like that. I like ambiguity and that uncertainty when, you know, the whole idea of design is often to create a kind of certain, you know where the handle is or whatever it is, the latest thing. But I think sculpture, to me, stands in absolute opposition to that. You don't know where the handle is, and you don't know quite what those legs are. I mean, they're performing as legs, but they're in the conventional sense, but then they're not conventional in any way. They've buried their conventionality in these extraordinary hoof-like forms. Yeah.
Yes, I'm writing notes like there's a question in the room, I think, in the middle. Was there, Daphne?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was just struck by Phyllida speaking about Louise Bourgeois and gravity, and I'd like to just ask Daniel and Phyllida, what about emotion? And because I see an awful lot of it in the show here, so how do you deal with emotion within the sculptures?
Emotion?
Emotion, I think. Emotion.
Yeah, emotion.
Maybe because for me, I worked the show, I made it alone in the studio, so, and I'm quite an emotional guy, so I spread it on them, or I communicate or relate to them, so they become emotional for me. And if I have this kind of interaction with them, I hope that they can have that with some of the people that come and see them. So I think it again comes from being with something, not making it, you know, living with it, and probably through the making of it, having a emotional relationship with it, which is to do more with maybe physical than thinking.
Yeah.
So that's how. But I think maybe what I try and create is spaces where people can have emotional interactions with the work. Where it makes them both think, but then feel, and try and kind of that sweet place between feeling and thinking, which maybe the body provides, you know, by standing next to something.
Do you think one can set out saying, I'm going to make a sad sculpture? Or do you think that the maker, in a way, as you're saying, just will either try and deny emotion, like, say, in a Jeff Koons, you know, where there's an immaculate finish and there's a sort of anesthetized but glorious object there. Do you think that the emotion becomes the responsibility of the viewer because the maker, in a way, I don't know how one would set out to make a work that had a specific emotion. Things happen, like a horizontal object. I mean, Louise Bourgeois talks about, you know, horizontality being a state of giving up, you know, and verticality being a state of being alert. You know, she actually imbues form with those emotional qualities, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. But those qualities emerge through, you know, maybe intentionally pushing something over and finding that that was the right decision. This should be a fallen object. I think then what that does for an audience is almost where I, as an artist, have to let go and just say, that does something to me. It completes something, it resolves something. But I think then how the viewer might just walk straight past it and not feel anything at all. But I think the emotional side is complex, I think. When I was teaching and a student would say, no, my work is about my emotions, therefore I can't talk about it in quite a hostile and prickly kind of way, it didn't convince me, you know, because I think the decisions are sometimes so practical, as well as needing all sorts of other qualities like spontaneity, time, gravity, all those other things, that emotion or the need for that to be the subject of the work just can't happen in a way. I don't know, I mean,
Have you an example of sad sculpture?
Sorry?
Do you have an example of sad sculpture?
I think there is there's a Bruce Nauman sculpture which I find one of the stripped animal ones that spin round. I find, yes, uncomfortable and torturous. Yes, there's a sadness because maybe in a sentimental way it sort of represents something about the animal kingdom being so subservient to human interference, you know. Yeah, that's as close as I can get.
We are running out of time, it's horrendous, but there's a question right here, a patient lady here.
Hi. I guess I was wanting to ask a bit more about the abstraction and figuration question, and I was thinking about what Phyllida said about the subject of your work being unpicking sculpture itself. And I was wondering if Daniel was doing that with figuration, but also whether figuration has always come out, like in the studio, maybe when you're at the Slade, does the figure always emerge from the things you're making in the studio in the same way that Phyllida is responding to the space or the materials?
So when I was studying with Phyllida, my work was not figurative at all. It was very abstract. Where does this figuration come from? I think maybe it's about a moment of looking at oneself, which is not a figurative moment. It's more like a thinking moment.
Mm-hmm.
So, although they are heads, but they are very much vessels. Even these works here, they are hollow. They do have faces, but they're not, although the show is called Looking, they're not really looking. They don't have eyes. So they are in this in-between space, between being a thing, a vessel. They kind of take us, but with, I think there's a framework, or for these works I used a sculpture, or sculptures that were made 3,000 years ago as a kind of frame to make these as a group. So I had a group that I could reflect upon, which is what I'm asking the viewer to do here, to meet them. But it's both an audience, but it's kind of these things as well, these objects, which are hollow and carry us. So they kind of maybe are very much in that in-between space of figuration and abstraction.
Do you think there is, I mean, these are words, aren't they? I mean, I find most sculpture has some, even a Donald Judd, or I mean, just thinking of Robert Morris's felt pieces, I find the legacy of 20th century sculpture, although it's called abstract, I find it intensely figurative, because it somehow bears the action of our size and our space, you know. And I sometimes find these words, which I think maybe you're touching on in some way, a kind of inconvenience to what our actual experience is when you're standing next to those, or standing next to the pink sculpture. That the language just falls away, you know. One's aware of one's own figuration as a body and the figuration of the thing in front of one, as one does in front of a Donald Judd or a whatever, you know. I think our own human state is so sort of powerful in its interaction that it makes that language somehow, your question is brilliant, but I'm just so curious about what the value of all these terminologies are now in this time that we're living in.
And maybe I'll continue and say that, you know, we could talk about them as figurative because they've got something of a body and something of a head, but maybe to really understand them, one has to imagine one's body being part inside of them all. Yeah. So I could look at them and see, can I fit my leg inside there, and how that would feel as a way of understanding them.
I'm going to draw this conversation with huge regret to a close. The question or the idea, what we wanted to explore with the two of you in the context of this show, was the notion of bringing matter to life. When Daniel told me that he had bumped into you, he said that the question you'd ask him was, how are the sculptures? In a very active, how are the sculptures? How are they doing? And I think this evening has proved that the sculptures are very well. And that sculpture itself is doing pretty well. And that matter, I mean, certainly for the three of us and the two of you, matter is one of the most important stuffs of life. And I can't thank you enough. It's been a real honour and a privilege to have such visual and material intelligence brought to bear in this space, in Scotland, in this show for us now. And it's been recorded and is online, and I think it was very important. Thank you very much. Can you all join me in thanking? Thank you.